I don't remember how many days passed before the door opened again. The apartment had been silent for so long. My toys were gone. The lights had gone dark when the power stopped humming. I had waited, hoping my mother would come back for me. But she never did. By February 2021, I was no longer waiting in the way I once did. I was still here, though, watching, unseen. That morning, the landlord had called my family. The rent hadn't been paid. My mother couldn't be reached. So my grandmother and her husband came upstairs expecting to find only an empty apartment. But they found me. Not the little girl they once knew, but what remained after months of silence and hunger. My grandmother's voice broke. Her hands trembled. The calls began. First the landlord, then the police. Soon, the apartment filled with strangers, men and women in uniforms, their shoes scuffed across the floor, flashlights sliced through the dust and darkness. They paused when they saw me, curled on the mattress against the wall. I heard them whisper. One wrote down, "Deceased child, suspected malnutrition, time of death, approximately 6 months prior." 6 months? Half a year had passed since I last felt water on my lips, since I last heard a kind voice. The room was stale with mildew. The refrigerator door hung open, nearly empty. A few old condiments, nothing more. Clothes sagged in the closet, but there were no toys, no meals, no warmth left behind. Everything around me said the same thing. I had been abandoned. The investigators crouched close, their gloves brushing the floor. They photographed my body from every angle. One of them muttered, almost under his breath, that I must have wasted away slowly. My bones were brittle. My skin had shrunk tight. They didn't need the autopsy to know, but later it would confirm what they suspected. I hadn't been beaten. I hadn't been poisoned. I had simply been left with nothing until my body could no longer hold on. Neighbors were questioned. Some said they remembered a young woman moving in and out months earlier. Others said the unit had seemed empty since the summer. A faint odor had lingered in the hallway, one neighbor admitted. But it was winter. They assumed it was plumbing. No one thought a little girl was dying just behind a locked door. The police quickly identified the tenant, my mother, 22 years old. She was listed as my guardian. When they found her, she admitted she had left the apartment months earlier after separating from her husband. She spoke little about me. Detectives noted her coldness, her vague answers. Why had she left me alone? Where had she been living? Why hadn't she come back? Her detachment raised new questions. Did she abandon me on purpose? Did she think someone else would step in? Or had she simply decided I no longer belonged in her life? The coroner's report deepened the mystery. I had likely died around August 2020. That meant my body had been left alone for nearly half a year before discovery. 6 months in the dark and silence without even the notice of those who passed by my door. As detectives retraced my family's history, a second shock arrived. DNA tests were ordered, routine in neglect cases, just to confirm relationships, but the results stunned them. The woman listed as my mother, the one they had arrested, was not biologically related to me at all. The DNA pointed elsewhere, to another member of the family, someone older, someone who, until then, had been only my grandmother. The investigators ran the tests again, then again. 4 times in total, and the results never changed. My grandmother, the woman living downstairs, was my biological mother. The discovery sent the investigation spiraling into chaos. What had started as a simple case of neglect now cracked open into something stranger. Family secrets, hidden births, and questions about who I truly was. Was there a baby switch at the hospital? Had my grandmother carried me in secret only to pass me off as my sister's child? If so, what became of the baby my mother was supposed to have had? My grandmother denied it all. She said the science was wrong. She said she had never given birth to me. But the National Forensic Service stood firm. The DNA was conclusive. The police faced questions they could not easily answer. If my grandmother was my mother, then who was my father? And did my mother, the young woman who abandoned me, ever know I wasn't really hers? Or had she lived her life believing a lie? News of my case spread quickly. Across South Korea, people recoiled. In a country where family bonds run deep, the idea that a little girl had been left to starve was already unthinkable. The revelation that her grandmother was actually her mother, and that her sister had been raising her all along, only fueled outrage. For the public, my apartment became more than a crime scene. It became a symbol of betrayal and silence, a bare mattress, a child's fragile body, neighbors who had smelled something but assumed nothing. As investigators carried out evidence bags, cameras flashing in the winter light, the questions only grew darker. Who was I really? Who had left me there? And why had my short life ended in such unimaginable loneliness? To understand how tragedy unfolded, we must turn back the clock, retrace each step, each person, each fracture in a family that remained invisible for far too long. We know only a few public details about the child. Her name, reported in some outlets as Borum, though not always consistently. She was approximately 3 years old at discovery. Some sources say 2. Fragile in body, absent from public view, and deeply vulnerable. Reports suggest her body had been left to wither silently in a locked apartment since around August 2020, roughly 6 months before she was found in February 2021. There's no portrait of her playing, no pictures released, only a chilling scene captured in investigators' notes. A silent mattress, skeletal remains, an absence of warmth that fills the viewer with dread even before the story truly unfolds. Kim, reportedly in her early 20s, 22 in media accounts, had separated from her husband and moved out of that apartment in Gumi in August 2020. According to her statement to police, she couldn't bear raising the child alone and left her behind when starting a new life and preparing for a second child with another man. Neighbors and records reveal that she may have deliberately cleared the apartment, taking nearly all her belongings. Food supplies were gone. The electricity had been cut off months earlier, indications that the flat had been empty, or at least unused for essential living since around May 2020. Kim was arrested on multiple charges, including abandonment, violation of child welfare and protection laws, and neglect. She admitted to leaving her daughter behind, but not to intentional harm. Her detachment from the child hinted at frustration and resentment. Still, no one expected the case to turn into something stranger. Seok, described in initial reports as the child's grandmother, lived below the apartment where the girl's body was found. She had visited the unit shortly before the body was discovered to follow up on lease and rent issues, reportedly unaware something like this could be happening upstairs. Police investigation then moved into murkier territory. Both women apparently gave birth around similar times, a convergence in timing that police saw as too suspicious to ignore. The forensic authorities performed DNA testing not only on Kim and Seok, but also on the ex-husband and possible other potential father figures. These results showed that the child's father was neither the registered grandfather, Seok's husband, nor Kim's previous partner. Within days, investigators were exploring the possibility that a switch had occurred, a baby swap between Kim's child and Seok's. The theory: Seok had perhaps given birth to an illegitimate child and covertly switched babies with her daughter's child in the hospital, raising her own child as the granddaughter. While Kim's biological daughter disappeared from view, police uncovered alarming clues. Search history on Seok's phone included terms like self-birth and birth preparation, despite no logged prenatal clinic visits. Her husband testified he had no knowledge of her pregnancy. A torn umbilical clamp and missing newborn anklet photo became evidence supporting the swap hypothesis. Forensic clues mounted. The child's blood type was inconsistent with Kim's known parameters, suggesting maternity was misassigned. The baby's tag was broken, not the kind of accident likely in regular postnatal care. Investigators assumed that Seok, potentially covering an illicit birth, had tampered with medical markers to conceal her motherhood, and in the process concealed or neglected Kim's child. But Seok remained resolute. Denial persisted even as prosecutors pressed forward. In early proceedings, she was indicted on charges of child abduction related to the alleged switching and corpse concealment. Kim, on her part, pleaded guilty to abandonment, telling police she couldn't raise the daughter from a previous marriage and left her when she became pregnant again. Across forums and comment sections, observers struggled to grasp the tangled horror. If Seok truly gave birth in secret, who was the father? Others asked a darker question. What had happened to Kim's real baby? Maybe the grandmother stole Kim's identity and gave birth under her name. The public reaction highlighted the collective sense of bewilderment. This was not only a case of neglect, it was a case of fractured truth, a hidden birth, possible conspiracy, and one child's silent extinction while the world presumed she was someone else's daughter. In 2021, the Daegu District Court Gimcheon branch sentenced Kim to 20 years in prison for neglect leading to death. The court also ordered her to complete 160 hours of a child abuse treatment program. That September, the Daegu High Court upheld the ruling, and by the end of 2022, the Supreme Court had confirmed it. Her fate was sealed, 2 decades behind bars. Seok's path was very different. In the same 2021 trial, she was sentenced to 8 years for abduction and attempted concealment, but in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned the abduction conviction, ruling that the alleged baby swap had not been proven. On remand in February 2023, the court acquitted her of abduction and instead imposed 2 years in prison, suspended for 3 for attempted concealment, a result the Supreme Court affirmed in May 2023. The final outcome left many furious. To the public, the idea that one woman walked free while another carried the full weight of the sentence seemed like a miscarriage of justice. Online forums filled with disbelief. How could the person who gave birth and may have concealed the truth from the start walk free, while the child's sister was left to serve 20 years? And yet, the courts had spoken. What endures is the silence of that apartment in Gumi. A bare mattress, dust settling in corners, neighbors walking past without knowing, a child left behind, unnamed in many reports, reduced to silence within 4 locked walls.